Finally, I'd like to welcome someone who has been on the front lines with Premier Wall, not only for the last decade in government, but for many years before that. Since 2007, Reg Downs has served as senior aide to the Premier and Executive Council, first as Chief of Staff to the Premier, then as Senior Advisor to the Premier, a role that he still holds today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our friend, Reg Downs.
Well, this has got to be the worst speaking position of all time. Right between the great Rex Murphy and Premier Brad Wall, so I am going to try and be pretty brief. In fact, I'm not even going to really talk about Premier Wall. So much has been said and written about Premier Wall since he made his announcement in August by people like Rex and Ken and Bronwyn and so many others about what kind of a premier he has been and what he has meant to our province and to our country. All of it so kind and eloquent and well-deserved that I don't think I have anything left to say about Premier Wall that hasn't already been said. So I don't want to talk about Premier Wall today. Instead, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my friend Brad. I had the good fortune to meet my friend Brad just across the river from here at the U of S when we were both in our first year of university. That was a long time ago. I was 18, I think Brad was still 17. Think about how young we were. We weren't even old enough to drink legally. And we never did. So I met Brad in our first year of university. I became his advisor shortly after that. I believe it was the night before his first stats final. He hadn't studied much, or at all, and he needed some help. Now, I don't want anyone to think that Brad wasn't a good student. He was, and he is, an extremely bright guy, a quick study, and he can pick things up faster than anyone I've ever met. And I'm sure he ended up doing very well in that stats exam. It's just that he did have a tendency to kind of procrastinate and leave things to the last minute, particularly with subjects he didn't care for that much. Sometimes I tell people that and they say, wow, I guess he must have really gotten a lot better about that now that he's premier. No, not really. In fact, that reminds me, Brad, you speak right after me. You should probably start writing your speech now. It's interesting, though, when people find out I've known Brad for that long, you get a lot of different questions about him. What's he really like? How has he changed since you first met him? How come he aged so much and you didn't? Sorry. Sometimes people ask, how did he become the elected guy, the high-profile guy, and you're kind of the behind-the-scenes guy? Well, that one's easy to explain, right, Brad? It's because you had me helping you out. All I had was you. What chance did I stand? It actually is a good question. What is it about my friend Brad that made him such a great leader for our party and for our province? And did I see that coming all those years ago? Yeah, I kind of did. There was just something really personable about the guy. People just liked him. Now, I don't really get this quality, but then again, I've been told I'm not the friendliest guy in the outfit. But Brad kind of is, and he has been as long as I've known him, and it's carried over into his political life. And I'm grateful for that. When Brad first became premier and I first assumed my new role in the premier's office, I remember being a little bit worried. I was worried that maybe it'd be hard for him and I to remain friends. There's a fair bit of pressure in that office, and if I'm doing my job correctly, that means sometimes telling him things he doesn't necessarily want to hear. So I remember worrying that at some point that would just get to be too much, and maybe we wouldn't be friends anymore. But that's never been an issue. Never. And I don't have any better explanation for that than just to say that my friend Brad is just a good guy. I've seen him get angry, but I've never seen him stay angry. He is just not someone who holds grudges or harbors any resentment or ill will toward anyone, less so than pretty well anyone I've ever met. So that's something I want you to know about my friend Brad. So it's been quite an evolution to watch over these past 30-some years. I think all of us have a few people, a few good friends that we go through the various stages of our lives with. Brad and I went to university at the same time. We started our careers at the same time. We got married in the same year. We had our kids around the same time. Actually, that's not quite right. Brad and Tammy did start a little bit before us. I know he wasn't procrastinating there. But politics has never been the most important thing to Brad. The most important thing to Brad is his family, his kids, and even before that, his relationship with Tammy. I've always known that Brad really loves Tammy because before they were married, they actually had a bit of an on-again, off-again relationship. And I had the great misfortune to be Brad's roommate during one of these off-again periods. Now, in the entire time I've known Brad, it's the only time I've actually seen him truly kind of miserable. And I can tell you it was no picnic for me either. I was his friend, and I wanted to cheer him up, but we're guys. We talk about politics and football, not feelings. So I didn't know what to say. You want a beer? You want to play Tecmo Bowl? You can be the Raiders. It's about all I had, but as it turned out, even Tecmo Bowl Bo Jackson could never take Tammy's place, and before long they were back together, and all was well with the world, and we never talked about our feelings again. So Brad and I have gone through all these important stages and stages and milestones in our lives at more or less the same time. But while that was going on, I also had this incredible privilege to have a front row seat as my friend Brad moved through this remarkable political life. From winning his first nomination, to getting elected MLA for the first time, to becoming an effective opposition member, to becoming party leader and leader of the opposition, to running his first province-wide general election campaign, to winning and becoming a rookie premier, and then a more experienced premier and getting reelected and reelected again, to finally to becoming the elder statesman among Canadian premiers, and finally to becoming the washed-up has-been he is today. You see, that's where I could use some help. I could use some editing right there. But I don't have a senior advisor helping me out. Although Brad might not either by the end of this speech. Here's something you should know about my friend Brad. Every Sunday morning, or almost every Sunday morning, he takes a couple of verses out of the Bible and he writes a devotion. And then he emails it around to his family and a few of his friends. It's always very thoughtful and heartfelt and wise, just some of his thoughts and some lesson he has taken from the Word of God and how it applies to his life or his job or just the world in general. So that's good to know. But here's something I know about my friend Brad that's even better. I know that he's the same man on Saturday night as he is on Sunday morning. I have one last thing to tell you about my friend Brad, and then I'll get out of here. Brad is not someone who would make up a bunch of rules and enforce them on his staff or on the party. But back when he was the leader of the opposition, he did have one rule that he was pretty strict about. As you know, when the opposition leader is being introduced at some event, opposition parties like to introduce their leader as the next prime minister or the next premier. Brad insisted no one was to ever introduce him in that manner. And it wasn't that he was superstitious or thought it was bad karma or anything like that, because he's just not like that. He just said, I haven't earned that title. And unless and until I earn that title from the people of Saskatchewan, no one is ever to call me that. And so we stuck to that rule, and no one ever introduced him that way. So it's election night, 2007. Brad's out in Swift Current, and I'm in Regina, and we're all watching the results come in, and the networks had just declared the first ever Saskatchewan Party majority government. And then someone hands me a cell phone and says, it's Brad. He wants to talk to you. Now think about that moment. We had just achieved this thing, that he and I and so many other people, so many of you in this room, had been working toward for so many years. And this was my first chance to talk to Brad. So there are a lot of things I could have said in that moment. Hello? Or congratulations? Or woohoo! Or way to smoke those NDPs? But I didn't. I didn't say any of those things. I took the phone and I said, Mr. Premier, I'm pretty sure I was the first person who called him that because there was kind of a long pause at the other end, like he thought he'd gotten the wrong number or something. But I finally realized that I was actually talking to him, and he said, oh, I guess you can call me that now. The reason I wanted to tell you that story is that over the past 10 years, I know there are a lot of people in Saskatchewan who have had some version of the following experience. They had some occasion to meet Premier Wall, at the legislature or at some event, or they ran into him in a restaurant or at the airport or somewhere, and they called him Mr. Premier or Premier Wall. And he said, call me Brad. It's just Brad. So I know there are literally hundreds of people in this province who have this great memory of the time they met the Premier, and they got to call him Brad. You see, I have a great memory too, but mine is exactly the opposite. I met Brad, my friend Brad, and then one night in November, 20-some years later, I got to call him Mr. Premier.